Hello, and welcome back to Forgotten Ties. Sometimes, our lives feel like a random series of events until one seemingly innocuous moment becomes the key that unlocks a long-buried secret. A secret powerful enough to shake the very foundations of your reality, to make you question everything you've ever believed. Our story today begins in just such a place, a quiet, unsuspecting corner of the world. Imagine a crisp autumn evening in the suburbs of Boston. The first cool winds of the season rustle through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Grace, a 42-year-old architect with a chic platinum bob and piercing gray eyes, is on her way home after an exhausting day at work. Her life seems perfect. A cozy Victorian home, a loving husband named Liam, a 50-year-old history professor with a salt-and-pepper beard and deep blue eyes, and two wonderful children. Yet, a mystery has always lingered in her mind, a void that has existed since she was a child orphan. On that fateful night, when her car got a flat tire on a deserted road, she had no idea her fate was about to change forever. She sat on the side of the road, her phone dead, the dim headlights illuminating the skeletal branches of the trees. It was in that eerie silence that a sound broke through. It wasn't a car horn, nor was it footsteps. It was a voice, sweet and sorrowful, drifting from a small wooden house nearby. An elderly woman with red-brown hair and a face etched with the lines of time sat on her porch, gently rocking a baby in her arms, singing. The tune, the melody, the words, they struck Grace like a physical blow. She froze, listening to every single note. Her heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was sure she could hear it. It was a song she had never consciously heard, yet it was so strangely familiar. A shiver ran down her spine. And then, a memory rushed back. Not a clear image, but a feeling and emotion. A deep sadness, an endless love. Grace recalled a dark room, the smell of old wood, and that same voice, singing that same lullaby. A voice she had tried to remember, vaguely recalling it in her nightmares and dreams, but never truly believing it was real. The familiarity was an obsession, a missing piece of her life's puzzle. Grace had always lived with the dull ache of abandonment, with the emptiness of a past without a mother. And now, a stranger's lullaby had stirred a memory of a love she thought she had lost. The woman continued to sing, her eyes closed, her face a mask of sorrow. The song ended, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Grace couldn't stop herself. She got out of her car and walked toward the woman. Each step was a struggle, a battle between her fear and her desperate need for the truth. The rational architect was replaced by a bewildered child. "That song," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "Where did you get it?" The woman opened her eyes, looking at Grace with a mix of surprise and panic, as if she had seen a ghost. She recoiled, pulling the baby closer. Her eyes were filled with fear, like a trapped animal. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You shouldn't be here." But Grace couldn't give up. She had been searching for this answer her entire life, without even knowing it. "That song is a lullaby," Grace continued. "The lullaby my mother sang to me." The woman stared at her, her eyes widening, and then she unexpectedly buried her face in her hands and began to sob. She mumbled incoherent words, "It can't be. It can't be." Grace moved closer, her heart about to burst. The woman knew something about Grace's past. And Grace knew she wouldn't leave until she had the truth. This story has only just begun, and the secrets buried in the shadows are about to be brought to light. Silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of the wind and the woman's sobs. The confrontation between Grace and the stranger wasn't just a chance meeting, it was the collision of two worlds, two lives that seemed unrelated. The woman, whose name was Eleanor, finally looked up. Her eyes were filled with pain and deep-seated secrets. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "That song, it was a lullaby my mother sang to me. She taught it to me, and I sang it to my daughter." Grace's heart pounded wildly. "Your daughter?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. "Who is your daughter?" Eleanor looked straight at Grace. A long moment passed, a moment that felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke. "My daughter went missing when she was a little girl." It was a kidnapping, a terrible crime that the police never solved. Her name was Anya. The name Anya echoed in Grace's mind. It was a name she had heard in her dreams and her nightmares. It wasn't her name was Grace, yet it felt so right. A horrifying truth began to dawn on her. Grace had been adopted, and she had no memory of her biological family. Eleanor began to tell her story, a story of profound grief. She and her husband, Robert, had lived a simple, happy life. They had a small farm and one daughter, Anya, with platinum hair and piercing gray eyes. Their life was a perfect picture until one summer morning, Anya vanished from their backyard. The police searched everywhere, but there was no trace. The case went cold, and her family was destroyed. Robert died of a broken heart a few years later, and Eleanor lived with the haunting guilt of a mother who had lost her child. As Eleanor spoke, Grace felt as though she was watching an old film, but the images in that film were her own. The feeling of having lived in a small wooden house, the smell of damp earth, and the sound of a woman's voice singing. Everything started to connect, a terrifying and painful story. She wasn't Grace, she was Anya. Grace, or rather Anya, could barely stand. "Is there anyone else?" Grace asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Anyone else who knows about this?" Eleanor sighed softly. "There was only one other person, an old friend of my husband's, a man named Samuel. He helped us after the kidnapping. But then he vanished. I don't know where he is. He left this city." A new piece of the puzzle emerged, but it only deepened the mystery. Who is Samuel? Why did he disappear? Was he involved in the kidnapping? Or was he just a good friend, a man grieving the loss of his friend's child? Grace knew she had to find the answer. She needed to know everything. "Do you know where he is?" Grace asked, her voice filled with desperation. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I don't. But he had a small cabin in Vermont. Maybe, just maybe, he's still there." With a glimmer of hope, Grace got the address of the Vermont cabin. She thanked Eleanor, promising to stay in touch. Grace returned to her car, but she didn't drive home immediately. She sat on the side of the road, staring into the rearview mirror. It wasn't the Grace she knew. It was Anya, a girl who had been stolen from her family. She felt a deep pain and a terrifying fear. This fear wasn't about a kidnapper, but about another secret. Grace had a wonderful life. She had Liam, a fantastic husband, and 2 lovely children. They had a happy life, and Grace was terrified that when the truth came out, it would destroy everything she had. But she couldn't give up. She had been searching for this answer her entire life, without even knowing it. The journey to Vermont wasn't just a physical trip, it was a deep dive into the past, into a pain Grace didn't know was hers. She hadn't told Liam about her meeting with Eleanor. How could she? How could she tell him that their life was built on a lie, a horrifying secret? What would he think? That she was an imposter? That their family was a sham? The cabin in Vermont was nestled among a grove of crimson maple trees. When Grace arrived, she saw an elderly man sitting on the porch, his hair white, his face a road map of wrinkles. It was Samuel. Grace walked closer, her heart pounding. "Mr. Samuel?" she asked. Samuel looked up, his eyes clouded, and then a look of shock appeared on his face. "Anya," he whispered. "It can't be." He stood up and walked toward her. "Robert and Eleanor's daughter," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "You've returned." Grace nodded. "How did you know it was me?" "Your eyes," he said. "Your mother's gray eyes. And your hair is platinum, just like Robert's. No one can fake that." Samuel invited Grace inside, and he began to tell the story from a different perspective. He was a close friend of Robert's, and he had witnessed everything. He said that Robert was devastated after Anya was lost. After the case went cold, Robert hired a private investigator. The investigator found a clue, a terrifying clue. Anya was not kidnapped, but was given to a young couple with the promise that she would be better cared for. Robert went to meet the couple, but they said they had received Anya from a mysterious organization. Robert tried to find the organization, but it was too late. As Grace listened to Samuel's story, tears streamed down her cheeks. Her life was a lie. Did her adoptive parents know the truth? Or were they also victims? My adoptive parents. Grace said, did they know? I don't know, Samuel said. I lost touch with everyone after Robert died. I couldn't bear to live in that city anymore. I couldn't stand the pain. Samuel gave Grace an old box. This is what Robert gave me, he said. He wanted me to keep it safe. Grace opened the box. Inside was a file and an old journal. The file was from the private investigator, filled with terrifying information. The journal was Robert's, Grace's, biological father. In the journal, Robert had written about his grief, about his inability to find his daughter. And then, Grace found a letter. It was a letter from her adoptive parents. To Anya, the letter began. We are not your biological parents. You were given to us by a friend of ours, who told us you were an orphan. We fell in love with you at first sight. We always wanted to tell you the truth, but we were afraid you would leave us. We have been so happy to have you in our lives. The letter ended with an apology for hiding the truth. Grace sobbed. Her adoptive parents hadn't known the truth. They had been victims of a mysterious organization. Grace felt a deep pain and a surge of anger. Who was that organization? What had they done to her? And why? Grace looked at Samuel. Who is behind all this? She asked, her voice filled with rage. Samuel looked at her. A powerful man, he said. A man named David Miller. He was the one who created that organization, a child trafficking ring. A new truth was brought to light, a truth more horrifying than anything Grace had imagined. She wasn't an abandoned child. She was a victim of a monstrous crime. Grace had her answers, but they weren't the answers she wanted to hear. Grace returned home, her emotions a whirlwind. On one hand, rage at being deceived, on the other, pain from her own tragic past. She found David Miller, a wealthy businessman who seemed harmless. But Grace knew the truth. Grace did everything she could to meet David Miller. She used her husband's name, Liam, to get an appointment with him. Grace and Liam met David Miller at a fancy restaurant. Throughout the meal, David Miller was friendly, but Grace could feel a hidden coldness in his eyes. Grace couldn't keep the secret. Mr. David Miller, she said. I'm not Grace. My name is Anya. David Miller looked at her, a look of shock on his face. Anya? He asked. It can't be. Grace took out her adoptive parents' letter and the investigator's file. She handed them to David Miller. This is the proof, she said. You trafficked me. You destroyed my life. And I want to know why. David Miller looked at the documents, his face slowly losing its color. It can't be. He mumbled. I thought you were dead. He looked straight at Grace, his voice turning cold. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't know the truth. David Miller stood up and walked out. Grace followed him. You can't escape, she said. You have to face the truth. But David Miller didn't listen. He ran outside and got into his car. Grace followed him, but he drove away. Grace returned home, not knowing what to do. She had found her enemy, but she was helpless. David Miller was too powerful. In her despair, Grace saw an envelope on the table. It was a letter from Liam. Grace opened the envelope. Liam knew everything. He had read her adoptive parents' letters, he had investigated David Miller, and he had uncovered a horrifying secret. Liam had written in his letter, I know everything. I investigated David Miller, and I uncovered a horrifying secret. David Miller is not our enemy. He was a friend of your biological parents. He did everything to protect you. Grace couldn't believe what she was reading. She continued reading. David Miller found Anya, and he gave you to your adoptive parents, his best friends. He was protecting you from a dangerous man, a man who wanted to kill you to inherit your biological parents' fortune. That man was Samuel. Grace was stunned. Samuel, the man who had helped her, was her enemy? Grace read on. Samuel was arrested for murdering your biological father. He had planned to inherit your parents' fortune, and he had framed David Miller. He created a false story to deceive you. Grace burst into tears. She had made a terrible mistake. She had trusted Samuel, a fraud, and she had confronted an innocent man. Grace called Liam, and he told her that he had called the police, and Samuel was arrested. Grace felt a sense of relief. She had found the truth. She had found her enemy. And she had found her family. Weeks later, Grace met Eleanor again. Eleanor hugged her and said, "You're home now." Grace smiled, a genuine smile. She had found her family, and she had found herself. And so, our story comes to an end, a story full of mystery, tragedy, and a truth that was finally brought to light. Life is a mystery, but sometimes a stranger's lullaby can be the key to unlocking a door to the past. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next captivating stories on Forgotten Ties. See you in the next video.